Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal study scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. As I record this, the team at ASA are working very hard to prepare for the 2019 ASA conference. It's going to take place in New Zealand. It's called Decolonising Animals. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. ASA is a great organisation. They hold really wonderful conferences, and I'm expecting the 2019 conference to be no exception. So if you're not involved with ASA, you should really think about the life choices you've made so far and get involved. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by MC Pony. MC Pony is a hip-hop artist, a musician, a songwriter, and she's also responsible for the intro music to this podcast. So if you've got a bit of Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals in your brain, you already know MC Pony's work. MC Pony is very passionate about animal issues. She has her own website called Vegan Enthused. She's on Facebook, she's on YouTube, so check out MC Pony. Okay, people, let's get down to serious business of the day. Once again, we're at the University of Sheffield. Sheffield is doing its very best interpretation or impersonation of a dreary English day, but nonetheless, I am here with a very, very wonderful guest who's going to light up the room and light up the podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Robert McKay. Robert, or Bob, is Senior Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Sheffield. And today we're going to discuss his book chapter, A Vegan Form of Life, which appeared in the book Thinking Veganism in Literature and Culture Towards a Vegan Theory. And that book was published by Palgrave in 2018. It was edited by Emeila, Quinn and Benjamin Westwood. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Hi.
Okay, Bob, take us through it. Why this chapter?
I guess this chapter had, it's a funny one. It's had a number of different sources of inspiration. I actually started working on it, and little bits of the work started was basically the first thing that I ever did working in animal studies, probably in the late 1990s. And I was starting to reflect on my own personal experience and trying to think about it, drawing on the kind of theoretical sources that I was interested in at the time. So at that point, I was really interested in the work of a cultural theorist called Judith Butler, who works on gender and the politics of sexuality. And I was really interested in trying to think about how ideas from her work might be reapplied to thinking about the question of species, how people think of themselves as human, or and how that human nature, or not so much human nature, but how the idea of the human is constructed. So I was sort of thinking about some elements in my personal life where people would describe my veganism in various kinds of ways and trying to make sense of it that way. And then towards I did that work, and then it didn't really go anywhere, and then it bubbled around, and I always drew on Butler's work in my teaching and things, and it remained important for me in terms of how I thought about my own veganism, how I thought about humans' attitudes to animals generally. And then sometime a couple of years ago, the editors of this book, Emeila and Ben, asked me to talk about veganism at this conference they were organising towards a vegan theory. And in the interim period, I had also been thinking about a separate kind of question, which was a little bugbear of mine, which was that I had started to see animal studies scholars and other scholars using the phrase form of life to describe different kinds of species. So they would say things like an animal form of life, or the chimpanzee form of life is very different to humans, or something like that. So they would couple up species with the notion form of life. And through some discussions, so my own reading and discussions that I've been having with another animal studies scholar called Tom Tyler about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, we had been talking a little bit about this notion. So the concept form of life is very important in Wittgenstein scholarship. It's a phrase that Wittgenstein used. He used it to mean a very particular kind of thing. And that the way that Wittgenstein would use it certainly cannot map directly across onto the experience of a species. And so the thing that was being elided or hidden there, when you act as if a species has an entire way of being, the core thing that's elided being that individuals of those different species might themselves have very individually different forms of life because of the ways that human beings interact with them or impact on their lives in various ways. That's elided when you drift over to this biological use of the phrase form of life to imagine that all chimpanzees have the same way of being. So I tried to bring these two things together to wonder whether there's a form of life which is being vegan.
Fascinating. Well, Bob, there's a lot in there that I want to break down a little bit and discuss a little bit further with you. And so it's interesting for me to think of the book chapter as having these component parts or having these elements to it. So if we start perhaps with Butler, and your opening analogy is something to do with veganism being equated with lesbianism.
Yeah.
Can you start by saying why gender politics or queer I guess, associations are significant or interesting for you when thinking about veganism?
Okay. So there's a couple of reasons for this, I guess. The first and most obvious one is that there's a long history in the development of the field of animal studies generally. An absolutely significant foundational moment is the linking of animal politics and gender politics. So work like most famously Carol Adams's, but other ecofeminists and related critics who looked at the relationship, the ways in which women and animals might be subject to equivalent, similar, parallel kinds of forms of domination. So that was that context was work that I had been reading and thinking about. It was very inspirational to me. I became an animal studies scholar because I read an essay called Feminism and Animal Rights by Josephine Donovan, and that was bubbling around in my mind. At the same time, though, a number of the premises of what you might call second wave feminism that was very influential in that work were being tested and had recently been being tested and stretched by theorists like Butler, in part because of the way that thinking of the domination of women or by patriarchy in a very monolithic kind of way tended to exclude or write out of the picture queer experience, I guess. So Butler's a take on this issue really, really basically is to argue that while it is a convention of feminist thought to point out that there's a distinction between biological sex and cultural gender, that people might have bodies that work in a particular way or are morphologically in a particular shape or whatever, that there are cultural discourses and practices that we can think of as gender, where people might say, well, masculinity is different from maleness. Masculinity is a cultural discourse, or femininity is a cultural discourse that circulates around, and it's attached to particular biological bodies. Now, Butler recognises the importance of this point, but she thinks something troubling within it. and that's that it rules out the idea that maybe cultural discourses and ways of the way that the culture constructs knowledge might be very significantly allowing us to understand sex or producing or creating the idea that sex must only be binary, that even the idea maleness versus femaleness is itself a cultural discourse. So having an opposition that separates culture on the one hand from nature on the other in order to have a political argument about the culture side is problematic for Butler. Now, to me, this is really interesting for human-animal questions because it's it's very similarly a core part of pro-animal discourse or, animal critique generally, to think, well, human-animal relations could be anything, but what we live in a kind of an anthropocentric culture, or an anthropocentric culture that tells us to think about our human-animal differences in particular ways and structure them through violence rather than through friendship or whatever. And one of the things that I became interested in was the way in which maybe that kind of critical argument might be driving a wedge between humans and animals and suggesting that humans are necessarily different from animals, and in fact thereby constructing an idea of what the human is. And I wanted to take that critique of the sex-gender distinction that you see in Butler and use it to critique the human-animal distinction as it plays out even within pro-animal discourses. So that's the theoretical underpinning. There's a sort of more light-hearted connection, which I start the paper with, which is the way in which actually often these kinds of discourses, human versus animal, man versus woman, straight versus queer, have a tendency which would be called intersectional. So they connections will suddenly be used and will appear between them. So the event that sort of gave the first impetus to the paper was the description of a veggie meal that was given to me, and it was described as, here is your lesbian food. So one of the things that's going on here is that the notion of lesbian is being emptied out of any kind of real content. It's being used to mean strange, non-normal, non-full, non-complete, not the correct way of doing things, a deeply strange way of doing things. And all of this sort of network of meanings is being carried over and used for the person who said it to make perfect sense as a way of describing vegan food or veggie food, which from that anthropocentric perspective is similarly strange, not complete. So a complete meal would have meat in it. These, just not right, off from the norm. So I was trying to see why are these connections working? What's implied by them? What's going on in the way that meat-eating culture thinks of what it is to be food or what it is to eat that's being displayed by this kind of quote-unquote joke.
So, Bob, you tell us that veganism isn't just about food choices. It's about something more than food choices, or not food choices alone. Mm-hmm. What is that something more? Can you tell us what it is to be vegan?
So, I'm going to give a roundabout and sort of non-answer to that question. The reason I make that kind of point in the book is more to suggest that I think of veganism not as something that is the necessary result of a particular ethical decision or a particularly solid and easily and well understood way of thinking about what animals are and what humans are and what therefore the duties of humans to animals are and these kinds of things. So not an easily rationalizable philosophical position, but rather it's something that basically cuts to the quick of what kind of a being you think you are, and what it might be to live a life. That's because I fundamentally drawing on some of these the sort of theoretical thinking from that we've talked about earlier in the interview from Butler. I sort of think that what it is to be human is constantly being constructed and reconstructed by and in the culture that we live in and by ourselves in relation to it. That means what it is to be human, what it is to be an animal, is essentially up for renegotiation, rewriting, rescripting. It's a story that we tell ourselves and continue to tell ourselves. And because of that, basically what you eat is a huge part of that story. And it's a way that you tell that story is what you eat. So it's not, they're all sort of bound up. And once you start to think of veganism that way, as a kind of fundamental different expression of what it is to be alive, what it is to be a living being in relation to other living beings, suddenly veganism starts to creep, or what being vegan is might, it's taking hold of and using a much richer and more emotionally deep set of investments that drive people's behavior. So, for example, who is your family? Who do you love? What is a friend? These kinds of questions they're not ethical. They have ethical implications, but they're not rationalizable. You can't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to decide whether I'm friends with Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan and whether I will continue to be friends with her. I'm going to make a list of pros and cons, and then on the basis of that large list of pros and very short list of cons, I'm going to decide to continue being her friend. This isn't how relations of emotion work. They're driven by much, I'll use the word deeper, kinds of investment. Not necessarily deeper, but investments that you can't 100% understand. You're affected in ways that are beyond your complete control. And that's going on through how you, that sort of thing is at play in what it is to be vegan for me. And so that's the rationale for me saying that it extends beyond just food choice. So it's I'm not making a point that would go something like this. Veganism is the most fundamental expression of a politics of justice, or a politics of compassion, or a politics of non-violence, and therefore if you are to be truly vegan, you should be non-violent everywhere. Not to say that I don't necessarily feel ways like that myself, but that's not the point that I'm making. The point that I would be making about veganism going beyond food choice is this idea of it being a much more strange and difficult to articulate expression of who you are.
So, Bob, is the concept of species up for grabs in your thinking, or is it just being kind of subverted and it's about interspecies relationships?
I guess there's two strands to that. So the concept of species is used in two, it's used in lots of ways, but two ways that I'll distinguish now. One is to distinguish between humans and all other animals. So that's one thing that people mean when they say cross the species divide. They mean the divide between humans and all other animals. And so the notion of being human might be opposed to being animal, and we might think that we're using what you'd call a discourse of species when you do that. The other example would be that it's a form of biological categorization that you can use to parcel out our understanding of different kinds of animal life. In my view, the concept of species is up for grabs in both of those contexts. So if you look at the history of science, you'll see that what it is to be a species is constantly changing and evolving. That is to say, it's what I would call a discursive production. So different institutions, call them, whether they're universities or the discourse of science or whatever, produces knowledge about animal life, produces categorizations of that knowledge of animal life, and that's what we understand as species. And throughout history, different forms of animal being move in and out of those categorizations. They're exceptionally flexible and fluid, and therefore they aren't just static biological facts. On the more humanities side of the equation, I suppose, there's to think of the idea of human versus all animals as the species divide. Now, I think that one of the things that animal studies is doing is calling that notion into various kinds of disrepute and showing that it's a bearer of particular kinds of political, violent political investments to try and parcel out what is life, so that some forms of that life, human forms of that life, can do things to other forms of that life that they want to. So for me, and this is a line that I have in the paper drawing from Butler, I would describe species as what's called a regulatory ideal. So she describes sex as a regulatory, biological sex as a regulatory ideal. And that, what she means by that, and what I would mean by saying species is a regulatory ideal, is that an anthropocentric, taking it over to the question of species, leave Butler to one side for a minute, what I would say is that we live in an anthropocentric human exceptionalist culture that wants to portray humans as radically different, radically better, and fundamentally, basically more valuable than all other forms of life. And one of the ways that it does that is to parcel out that life into different kinds of box. And one of the boxes is called human. And however, that same culture will very happily play with those boxes and mess with them in order to redistribute value in whatever way it likes. So, for example, by animalizing particular people who would normally be in the human box, dehumanize them for a bit, animalize them for a bit, and thereby validate different, more nasty kinds of treatment of them. So these are good examples for me of the way in which what it is to be human is itself a kind of it's a tool used by an anthropocentric culture in order to make it possible for humans to do the kinds of things that they want to do to other forms of life.
So, Bob, this is a little bit left of centre, but no doubt you'll have something to say. Just very recently, I've noted more kind of mainstream media contributions to the project of defining and redefining veganism. Whose job is it to define veganism?
Okay, well, I mean, this isn't something that I explicitly talk about in the paper. The paper is very heavily draws on the philosophy of Wittgenstein. A particular aspect of the way his philosophy works is not something I tackle in the paper, but it's relevant here. The truth of the matter is that the word veganism will be defined and means how people use it. So people will continue to use it and use it in ways that make sense. That's a troubling thought for people who would like to have ownership of the meaning of veganism, but unfortunately that isn't how language works, and we don't get that ownership. You can participate through other uses of veganism, and you can argue that that's a bad way to use it, but that doesn't fundamentally give you control over it, unfortunately. So I think myself that a good and meaningful use of the word veganism necessarily would sort of recognize its history and its and the meaning of that word and the development of a kind of pro-animal politics in the mid 20th century, and tie it to particular dietary choices and recognize the importance of those dietary choices, rather than, and so that maybe I'm the example that you're talking about. I don't know if I'm referring to what you're referring to, but like recent uses, for example, that would do something like this, rather than see vegan as a name for a necessarily consistent application of a particular dietary choice. So someone is vegan if they do not eat certain, or they do not use certain animal products. A flip side of that, and one that's driven by a kind of capitalist commodifying culture, would be any practice of eating that does not, so any particular meal, any particular dish served in a restaurant that doesn't include animal products would be vegan, and therefore anyone who ate that dish would be vegan when they're eating that dish. And there'd be no sort of implicit logic in the use of the word that would sort of spread to a more consistent set of practices. What that then results in is a sort of proliferating kind of the possibility of a flexitarianism, for example, where someone can eat a vegan meal for this meal, but there'd be no logical implication that they might be doing that at any other meal, so that veganism itself just becomes a commodity to be consumed. So these things are troubling, they're politically troubling, and therefore are important to argue against. However, that arguing against them isn't about fixing the meaning of the word vegan, because that's not something that any one utterance, any one claim can do. That's not how language works. Language works by communities of individuals expressing themselves in ways that are meaningful and using words in ways that are meaningful to them. So if people keep finding it meaningful to describe this particular dish rather than all the others as vegan, then that's going to be what vegan means.
Fascinating. Well, Bob, I ask everyone who comes on the program to answer quick questions. You're a return guest, so in your case, you've got 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
I am indeed.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of being an animal studies scholar?
For me, it's just it's being part of a posse of animal studies scholars, of meeting other people who have new, different ideas about the topic that I'd never thought of, and being in the position to talk to other people who vaguely understand what I'm talking about and are interested in that and want to talk back to me about it. So it's the community aspect. I don't particularly love the individual scholar aspect of academic life. There are moments when I really enjoy it, but I think being true to myself, I like talking to other people in person more than I like sitting in a room by myself writing things down. Wonderful.
So what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of being an animal studies scholar?
I don't know if this is specific. In fact, I don't think it is specific to animal studies scholarship. It's the most challenging, disheartening aspect of scholarship in the 21st century. So it's that I'm in the lucky position to be relatively very well resourced to do the research that I want to do and can do. I work in a university who cares about me spending time thinking and writing, and gives me the opportunity to teach in ways that I can draw on that research and, in fact, work with students to learn myself. I'm very, very conscious as I do that that collegial team of people that I just talked about in my previous answer, many of them, the vast majority of them, are not in that same situation. So that would be, in particular, the undergraduate students who are under terrible pressures of time and money, to be able to think in ways that can challenge my thinking and I can work with them productively on. It's the people who want to go on to do graduate work, and it's very difficult for them to find funding, and even if they do, the funding is extremely comes with a very great set of demands that are difficult to meet. It's the early career scholars who then get their PhDs and are expected to just work for all the hours that God sends without remuneration to be able to develop a career, and are having to try and imagine contributing to a scholarly field in those circumstances. So I'm very conscious of that. With every free hour that I get to read some random short story and think about what it means for animals, how difficult it is for other people to do that work.
Indeed. So, Bob, this is your opportunity to give a shout out to an animal studies scholar who you think listeners should be aware of. It could be an emerging scholar. It could be a scholar who writes in a language other than English. It could be someone working in another field but whose work is relevant to animal studies scholars. Who would you like to shout out?
I'm going to give a very brief answer and then a slightly longer one. I don't want to specify any one emerging scholar. There are a great number that I really like, and I'm working currently on an edited collection with two co-editors called the Palgrave Handbook of Animals in Literature, and there's going to be we're basically publishing a number of essays by early career scholars in there. So I would encourage people to wait for that book, and when it comes out, read the work of those scholars. The person I'd really like to recommend people to check out is a novelist called Bridget Brophy, who I've done a lot of work on, and I'm doing some more work on now, who was very, very significant in the development of animal rights in the late 20th century. She published an essay called The Rights of Animals in 1965, and then she published some short stories through the late 60s and early 70s that are the kind of first, to me, very significant forays of literary endeavour into thinking about animal ethics, very determinedly. That's probably a harsh way of putting it, not the first, but they're very significant in the late 20th century development of animal rights. So Brophy's work is really amazing. She's a wide-ranging writer, but she's very crucial for contemporary thinking about animals and ethics. So she's my shout-out.
Wonderful. I thought you were going to direct us to Marilyn Monroe there for a minute.
Well, everyone should always be directed to Marilyn Monroe.
So, are you optimistic about the future of human-non-human animal relations?
This is the question that I struggle with the most. I'm fundamentally quite an optimistic person. I think that I would just say my optimism can span hundreds of years, and therefore I can feel hopeful. I see a lot to be very upset about in the short, medium, and long term. In the very, very long term, I could have some hope.
Oh, that's nice. Well, Bob, what are you working on next?
I mentioned the Palgrave Handbook of Animals in Literature. That's a kind of big endeavour that's going to take a good chunk of the next 6 months. I'm currently working on the introduction to a book called Animal Form, which will be about the politics of literary writing about animals in the late 20th century. So that's I'm going to be reading a short story of Brophy's, doing an interpretation of the short story, which is about someone who is not at all keen on hunting, and dupes some hunters into wearing deer's antlers so that they all shoot each other. Goodness. So a nice misanthropic story, which I'm going to try and think about and write about.
Wonderful. Well, Bob, how can people find out more about your work?
They can visit my webpage on the University of Sheffield website. So it's they can just go to the University of Sheffield homepage and Google my name or search for my name in the search box there. I've got an academia.edu page where I put all of my published work on there, so anyone who is working somewhere where it's harder to get hold of published research, or especially the book chapters and things that come out in very expensive books, you can look on my academia page and read anything of mine there.
Wonderful. And should we give a shout out to Shark?
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of the co-directors of the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre, which is just a group of scholars and a large group of postgraduate students and master's students who work on, I guess broadly speaking, qualitative analysis of animal life and human-animal relations. And so we're very open to anyone who wants to come and engage with us, come to any of our talks, come and study with us. You can Google Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre and find out what's going on there.
Wonderful. And you can follow Shark on Twitter. So Sheffield, as I'm learning, is one of the real hotspots for animal studies in the UK and indeed the world. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
You're welcome.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. Knowing Animals has a Facebook page and an Instagram account. But more important than all of that, please think about leaving a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.